Day 151. The sun came up over the ridge in the far distance. Roger got up and ate an apple and drank some water. He really wanted a cup of strong coffee and a smoke, but he wouldn't risk the fire or the smoke from a cigarette. He didn't know if anyone was actively searching for him in these woods, but he wasn't taking any chances. He was running full stealth mode for the time being. He packed his gear quickly and headed off further into the woods. At the church, Jillian sat silently watching her children sleep. Their sweet innocence warmed her heart. She was troubled about what the two youngest had seen yesterday. They were too young to fully understand, but she knew that it could be surprising just how much they noticed and retained at that age. They were scared on the ride home last night, but seemed to bounce back quickly after settling in here. Still, she was concerned about how it would potentially affect them. She sat and prayed in silence. She thanked the Lord for watching over and protecting them yesterday. She thanked the Lord for putting that man there at that time. She didn't even know his name, but she felt very connected to him at this moment. Carl Fairley would be riding into town alone today, as Pastor decided to remain at the church. Carl wanted to question Jillian further, but Pastor asked him to give her some time. He agreed, although he knew the longer he waited, the less chance he had of catching this stranger who killed these men in the alley yesterday. Still, at Pastor's request, he would give Jillian some more time. When he arrived in town, he went over to question the foreman of the railroad work detail. He confirmed that one of the dead men did in fact work for him. He also reported that one of his workers did not show up for work this morning. He went to check on him and found his tent empty and the man gone. He gave Carl a description and the man's name. Of course, when Roger had signed into the work detail to establish a cover for his black market liquor operation, he had given the foreman a fictitious name. In fact, when he prospected for the MC just after returning home from Vietnam, he had given them a fake name as well. No matter how good his investigative skills were, Carl Fairley would never trace Roger's information to anyone real. The name attached to his social security number was not Roger or Frank. It was the name his mother had given him at his birth. It was known to no one other than Roger. He hadn't used it since he left the Army decades ago. Living and working on the motorcycle club hadn't required any detailed documentation. Roger had the keen ability to adapt and overcome. He could become anybody or anything he wanted to now. He just had to concentrate on surviving until he can get away from this area. Yes, he thought. Put as much distance between him and this place as quickly as he could. That was his plan. Having started out early, he estimated that he logged almost 6 miles by noon. He had doubled back and around a couple times to make sure nobody was following his trail. As he hiked up onto the ridge across the valley from where he had camped last night, he walked between two very large granite outcroppings near the peak. The narrow opening led to an open field on top with a view of the valley below. He crawled in the prone position to the edge of the top of the granite outcropping, pulled his binocular out. He carefully surveyed the area from which he had just hiked and was sure nobody was following him. He had not hiked on any established trail, choosing instead to bushwhack. He knew only the most skilled tracker would have the ability to follow him. Satisfied that he was alone, he sat, looking at the expansive view before him. He lit a smoke and started a small fire to boil some water for coffee and make some broth from some dehydrated veggie soup mix he had in a sealed bag in his pack. While waiting for the water to boil, he reached in his pocket and found the track that Jillian had given him the day before on the platform outside the post. He read it several times. The notion that we are all sinners, all born with an inherent sin nature, was easy for Roger to understand. It was the part about Jesus dying on the cross and paying for our sins that confused him. This notion that no matter what terrible things one had done throughout their life, they were able to be forgiven by God. That if he truly was sorry and repented of his sins, he could be forgiven. That was overwhelming to Roger. He thought to himself, yeah, maybe for some people, but not me. Not after all the horrible things I've done throughout my life. He read the part that explained that by asking Jesus to come into your heart and be your personal savior, one could be saved and be assured of an eternal home in heaven. He thought that there was no way he qualified for this salvation they spoke of, that he was too far gone. What he didn't understand yet was that true biblical salvation comes from God's grace. Grace is unmerited favor. Nobody can qualify for it. If we could, it wouldn't be unmerited. Still, he thought to himself, imagine if it could be so. He sat and smoked and stared at the beautiful sunny sky and dared to dream for a brief moment. Then, in the distance, he noticed a power line running east to west up on the mountain. He couldn't explain it, but he had a feeling that he could not ignore or suppress. He felt like he should follow that trail. No, he said to himself, keep making your own trail. Follow your instincts and stay off the beaten path. His military training coming to bear, he knew he should stick to the dense forest. Still, as he looked at the power line, he felt an overwhelming feeling that he should take it instead. Conflicted, he just sat and smoked and looked over the area before him. Off in the distance, adjacent to that power line, he noticed a tower. He aimed his monocular on it, adjusting the focus. It was a church bell tower, he thought. His thoughts turned to Jillian. Being in town yesterday had nearly cost her life, as well as the lives of her children. And for what? Just to try to lure people into church? He wondered again what was in it for her. Then he closed his eyes, and he felt the warmth of her smile, the warmth of her soul. He looked at the picture of the church that was printed on the track. There he saw the tower. He looked again in the distance. He couldn't be sure, but he thought to himself that it could be the same tower. He was fighting something inside his head. He shoved the track back into his pocket and said, no, stick to the woods. It'll be safer there. He reasoned that his wit and instincts had served him well his whole life. Why divert from that now? He had survived decades and countless trouble by relying on his own intellect, his own wit and instinct. Then it hit him. Yes, he had survived. But that was all he had done. Just survived. Here he was, in his 60s, alone. No family and no real friends. Nothing to show at all for years of toil and sweat. Yes, he had survived, but he had not prospered in any way whatsoever. He owned nothing but the things he could hastily stuff into his rucksack. He could die today, and not one single person on this earth would care or even notice the fact that he was gone. Even the club, to which he had devoted his whole life, was now seeking to destroy him, he was sure. Then that unexplainable feeling welled up inside him again, overflowing out of every pore in his being. He knew then that he would follow that power line trail. He would walk down the unknown path. For the first time ever, he would go against his instinct, against what he thought in his own heart and mind to be best. As he looked out at the view before him, he felt at peace. He ate his soup and drank his coffee. He kicked out the fire and put his pack on. He started out toward the trail in the distance. Carl Fairley had obtained a picture of Roger, or Frank as he was known to the railroad foreman. Every worker that signed on to the work party had their pictures taken for record-keeping purposes. It was like a police mugshot, Carl thought. One picture from straight on and one from each side profile. Roger was wearing a t-shirt for the picture, and Carl noticed in one of the profile pictures the airborne tattoo on his arm. It was partially obstructed by the t-shirt sleeve, but Carl recognized it. When the photos were taken, the men were not previously notified. As they were going through an orientation session at the railroad headquarters, they were told to line up for the photos. It was a hot day, and Roger had on only his t-shirt. He had no way to hide the tattoo for the photo. He certainly would have if he was able to. He knew this exposed him, but there was nothing he could do at the time. Carl sat in his office, studying the photo. He had never met Roger, but looking at the picture, he felt as though he knew him. Carl lifted the blotter on his desktop and pulled the photo off of his desk. He studied it for a moment. It was a photo of Carl and 3 other men. They were standing in front of a Humvee in the desert, somewhere near Afghanistan. The patches they wore on their BDU shirts were different than the tattoo on Roger's arm, but they identified the men as airborne rangers nonetheless. Although a generation separated them, Carl felt that this man could be his brother. Carl sat alone, pondering the situation at hand. He had 3 dead men. One, Jillian, and this man had witnessed murder the other unidentified stranger. He was a railroad worker, but that was all they knew about him. He was alone in town and had come on the first train to join the work party. Carl knew even less about the stranger who stepped forward to save Jillian and the children. A railroad worker as well. He witnessed the murders also, and had some knowledge of or ties to the murderers. He may or may not have been prior military. In his 60s, fit and average looking, gray hair, no facial hair. He also had a picture of this man and a name which he had no way of knowing was fake, even though he suspected it was. Then he had a 3rd man associated with the murders who had fled the scene. He was definitely wounded, as Carl recovered evidence of blood from the scene at the alley entrance by the street into which the man fled. No record of him with the railroad or anywhere else. Unless he died somewhere from his wound and his body turned up, Carl figured he was long gone at this point. No casings recovered at the scene, which meant Carl didn't know what caliber of gun the man was shot with. Carl had recovered a cigarette butt under the chair outside Roger's tent. He placed it in a sandwich bag and put it in his jacket pocket. There was no doubt there was DNA on it. Even though he couldn't run it currently, he knew someday those systems would likely be put back up and running. This was the only hard evidence they had that could connect them to Roger. Then he thought about Jillian and the kids. He stared at Roger's picture, the man he knew as Frank. He slid the picture into a file folder along with the notes he took while talking to Jillian yesterday. He also put in the file notes he had taken from interviews with the railroad foreman and 2 men that had spent time working with Roger. He placed the folder in his file drawer and closed it. He looked out the window into the street. He decided not to further question Jillian. She had been through enough. He would send the railroad records of Roger with the fake name on it back to the railroad headquarters in the city. He would have it posted on a public bulletin board looking for friends or family. He would investigate further into this man if, and only if, someone came forward from that inquiry. He decided to spend any efforts in this matter searching now for the wounded murderer that fled the alley. He was not optimistic about his chances of making much progress in this direction. Still, He would keep the case open and see if anything turned up. Somewhere inside himself, Carl hoped that nobody would come inquiring about Roger. He was more than okay with just letting him fade away. Although he couldn't declare it publicly, Carl, too, was of the opinion that this man was a hero. That opinion would be reinforced every time he looked at Jillian and her two youngest children. Every day for the rest of their lives was a day that they would live because of this stranger. Carl hoped he never saw or heard of this man again. Thanks for watching. Please like and subscribe and share the videos. God bless you.